we've forgotten how to do this now.
Yeah. Welcome back to an infinite deal of nothing.
Yay. Yeah, it's been a while.
It has.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Whose fault is that?
Mine. Here, there, and everywhere.
It's a good Beatles song, that.
Yeah. I don't know it, actually. I'm not a Beatles diehard like you.
Here, There and Everywhere is a very famous song.
I don't listen to the Beatles.
I will have to fix that.
Yeah.
If I'm having to listen to Sam Fender now.
You would like that.
Go there, I dare you.
No, I didn't.
Go there, I dare you.
No, I stopped myself, see?
We're recording this on the day of Sam Fender's new album, and Oliver got tickets to his concert. How are you feeling?
Relieved. Very relieved.
Yeah.
I didn't think, because for the first tour in December, I tried 3 different pre-sales and general sale, and I didn't get them. I have no self or financial control whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they weren't cheap, were they? No.
That was a very expensive start to our seminar this morning.
We're at a new semester of uni now.
We are?
Yeah. We weren't even in the second semester last time we recorded.
Oh my god, yeah.
That's how long it's been.
Yeah. We're chipping away at our new modules and...
Yeah, we're no longer getting taught Dawn of Print. Although we keep going back to Jonathan Swift.
We do. We were in poetry today, and we had to come up with our own...
Poetry movement.
Yeah, our own, poetry movement. What was ours? The
Interpolation.
Yeah.
Interpolative movement.
Interpolative movement. That
Interpolative movement.
Yeah, and the first bullet point was makes use of a Jonathan Swift level of wit.
Never moving on from Jonathan Swift.
Yeah.
But today we are going to come back with a discussion of romanticism and romanticizing aesthetic.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a very interesting conversation to have in relation to writing and how we perceive ourselves as writers. I mean, in life in general, to be fair.
Romanticism, not as such in the romantic lyric sense, in the more contemporary romanticize your life aesthetic sense.
Yeah, I mean, when we were planning for this episode, I said to Oliver that it always reminds me of those really aesthetic, clean girl day in the life videos.
Yeah.
Where they wake up at 6:30 and they have their shower and then they do Pilates and they... Yeah.
Come with me on my definitely 100% realistic day in my life.
Maybe we're just jealous because we just wake up at
probably
a reasonable time and drag ourselves out of bed despite having 9 hours of sleep. Or maybe that's just me.
I didn't say a word. Did not say a word.
Your face speaks 1,000 words.
Expressionist. Speaking of movements, yeah, it's something that we've talked kind of extensively about casually. And I just thought it'd be interesting to bring that discussion to something more formally recorded for the podcast. So that's what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah.
Where it will lead, I'm not sure. But we found that the looser the structure we have, the more, from our perspective, interesting the episodes end up being. Is when we have less of a structure, we just see where our... We're saying it's going to be about romanticism now, but give us 32 minutes and we'll see where we're at.
I like the realistic expectations we're setting here. Also, we are both quite lethargic right now.
Yeah, we just got back and I sat down on my chair. I was like, I could just sit here and read now.
Yeah, I've had to drag him to do this episode. Tut.
Yeah, especially because we are now going to such a high energy event tonight.
Oh yeah, we're gonna be I'm gonna be so overstimulated out there, I feel.
Yeah.
It's gonna be interesting.
Yeah.
Poetry slamming.
Yeah, Say Out Slam. Whoever wins it, this will be in the future, so congratulations. I've got who I want it to be, but I'm not going to disclose.
I know nothing. Anyway, on to the topic of discussion. When we're saying romanticism and romanticized, I suppose, or romanticizing is an actual verb of doing.
Deliberately
fantastical,
excessively floral,
yes,
and whimsical,
but not
rooted in reality.
Yeah, not for purpose, but rather for
aesthetic or perception.
Yeah, perception. I think that's the better way of putting it.
Yeah, the
idea of portraying yourself in a more excessive and floral way, or portraying your writing in a more floral way to get a certain perception or a certain appearance. So we're not necessarily condemning this. I think is a good way to start this off.
Yeah, and also people can have different opinions, so that's fine. I don't need to patronise whoever's listening by saying that, but
this is true.
But
I think ultimately that's what it boils down to, is different opinions, and romanticism in the modern context is a really interesting idea because of, I suppose, consumerism. Like, the idea of not judging a book by its cover has become so incredibly false in modern day, I think. Because, I mean, I'm a stickler for it.
I do, for sure. Yeah. Well, also, I think it's an essential... Like, I'm really interested... We talked about this, like, ages ago, but the book as an object and the physical thing. So I think the cover design is a huge part of that. And ultimately, you know, as is with any kind of purchase, you have to be attracted to the product in order to purchase it. Like, if you're not familiar with it, something has to catch your eye in order for you to want to pick it up and buy it. And I think, well, book covers are a prime example of that. And that people who say don't judge by the cover, that's fine, but ultimately it doesn't mean the covers aren't important, because if you're not familiar with something in a bookshop, you're going to be drawn to something by the cover. Yeah. Because it's the only judgment you have initially. You know, you might go to the cover and then you go to the blurb, but your initial thing is always going to be the cover. So aesthetic is inherently important, whether you agree with that or not.
Yeah, I think in one of our modules we're discussing like the actual production of a book, and one thing that has become strikingly more apparent is how in modern day aesthetic has become so integral to books now. For example, Penguin books are a really good example of this. In the past, they used to just be like quite an ugly orange or like quite...
Orange I very much like, though.
Yeah, but like a very simplistic colour that did not tell you at all what you were going in for. I don't think books can be sold really like that anymore. I think they can because it's Penguin and like it's got that vintage link. Yeah. But ultimately, that is not what books are anymore. And like the movement towards focus on aesthetics not only influences the inside of a book, but also the exterior of it. And I think that's a really interesting conversation to have. Just in terms of how we've become so much more visual, I think.
Yeah, and also I think in terms of the business side of it, especially with internet culture now and books, certain books of a certain quality or lack thereof are getting kind of more popular than ever. And with that, again, you know, publishers, as we're learning, don't necessarily know how to respond. They can't keep up with the sheer speed at which the internet moves. Yeah. Especially like TikTok and Instagram Reels and stuff. Things just trends come in and out so quickly. One thing I've noticed in particular that happens at an alarming rate at the moment of the past maybe 6 or so months is special editions. And I feel like special editions, I love them, and I think there's something that, you know, people prize, and if you love a book so much, of course you're going to want a special edition. I have special edition of books I really like. Yeah. However, it seems to be these, actually, if you proper look at them, quite tackily produced, excessive, extravagant special editions that are coming out at the moment for these, you know, incredibly popular books that are being picked up crazy by the internet. And you can just see the underbelly of the business is so exposed. I find it quite sickening to see, which sounds like a weird thing to say because obviously I know I'm incredibly interested in publishing, and I know publishing fundamentally is a business. Even if you're not trying to make money and you're a micropress, it's still kind of entrepreneurship, it's kind of business. It's the same with in a lot of instances, but when the consumer can see the underbelly of the business, that's when I think there's a bit of a problem there. And because of the speed of internet culture right now, and they know that, you know, people are going to be easily influenced to buy these tackily produced special editions now, the speed at which they're coming out is quite scary, and we're kind of losing the actual importance of a special edition because it doesn't feel as special anymore.
Yeah, I think like an interesting point raised there is the sickening nature of seeing consumerism come into contact with such a creative outlet. I think maybe personally, this is probably a controversial opinion, but especially with creative outlets like writing or maybe painting or whatever, it is always quite jarring to come into contact with the fact that consumerism and aesthetic has sort of started to corrupt that now. Because, you know, on its most fundamental nature, those things are outlets for the human mind and to, like, you know, process or communicate and express, whether that's through like a really simplistic escapist narrative or like through like something genuinely quite political and striking. Even still, whether you're reading a fantasy book that's meant for like, you know, just a bit of fun, or whether you're reading like a politically inclined evocative book, they're both being marketed based on aesthetic. And that's really quite I don't know. Scary.
It's not necessarily good or bad.
No.
But it's just quite a peculiar realisation to have.
Like the fact that if you had 2 books and both of them were about something political and one maybe was articulated better and argued a lot more confidently and educated, but it had an uglier cover, you would be way more inclined to pick up the other one. I think that's the really dark, quite fundamental, basic view of aesthetic. And why it's quite scary in modern day and our obsession with it.
Yeah.
But I will be the first to admit I'm quite a stickler for aesthetic. You tell me a book's like, I don't know, Dark Academia or something, and I'm like, yeah, I'll probably have a look. But again, that comes under the TikTok marketing side of things. Playing into aesthetic is
ultimately a marketing tactic.
Yeah. Speaking of Dark Academia books and aesthetic, Secret History is a really good example of a conversation about the dangers of aesthetic.
Yeah.
And the dangers of the obsession with it. But I actually think that's quite an interesting book to read, because I would say that Donna Tartt's writing is quite aesthetically pleasing.
In its kind of deliberate pretension, do you mean?
Yeah. I actually don't know if it's deliberate. I think that might just be naturally how she writes.
It's how she speaks.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's quite interesting that someone that writes so aesthetically condemns the very pursuit of it.
Yeah, that's true. I found it kind of interesting that I immediately was like, oh, I have this on my shelf, I'll reach for it. Even the fact that we filmed this, this is a podcast, and podcasts traditionally are maybe audio.
Yeah.
But even the fact that we're inclined to film it
with this backdrop,
it's a nod to the inherent
need to appeal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why it's a really interesting conversation to have, and not necessarily, again, it's not about condemning, but it's like interesting to realise how much romanticising and aesthetic has become so ingrained in us. Like, it is actually really, like, weird. And I think it's especially an interesting conversation when it comes to, like I said, creative outlets.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I think it's really difficult as a writer to balance between wanting to be successful and wanting to write what you want to write and being raw in that presentation. And I think like poetry is a really interesting thing for that very reason, because I suppose for me, as someone that's seen a very romanticized traditional view of poetry, it's not necessarily a planned or edited thing. It's presented as like, me expelling my emotions and me being really incredibly raw. That's like the stereotypical view of poetry, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like the emo kid writes poetry because no one understands them, sort of thing. And that in and of itself is an aesthetic of poetry. I find poetry quite scary for 2 reasons. In that, one part of me, I say, oh, I'm really shit at poetry because I'm not technically good at it. Technicality-wise, ain't no way you're going to catch me writing a haiku or a sonnet or something, because I cannot do it. I can't do form, I'm not well educated on enough, which again, whatever. But then on the other hand, it's like, I find it quite daunting, because I think there's a beauty in poetry being a form that is really good to explore rawness and being raw and quite vulnerable with. And those are 2 such opposing points, because how can you value the technicality of something, therefore being aware that it's incredibly edited and carefully crafted, while also acknowledging it as being quite a raw, vulnerable thing? And I think there's something juxtaposing about that, but I think it pulls to that, obsession with aesthetic.
I think the thing that actually led us to this discussion, even though we were leaned more towards the kind of literary side of the argument, is I think our conversation started a long time ago about, romanticism in the everyday. There's a lot of talk at the moment, especially, again, me and the internet, you'll just see us having conflict all the time. Because of internet culture at the moment, in the past couple of years, there's been a surge in people, quote-unquote, romanticising their lives, romanticising their days. And I think it's a nice idea, want to be more present in your day or whatever, and trying to notice the simple little things. But ultimately, I kind of take the stance that you can consciously try and do that as much as you like, but if you're having to consciously make yourself romanticize, you're inherently not a romantic person. And I mean romantic in, the practical sense we're talking about, not in the, initial thing you might think about.
Hopeless romantics, not in that sense.
Yes.
But in the, movement sense.
Yeah. It's just a really strange trend and thing that's happening a lot recently.
Yeah.
is kind of people make whole videos being like, spend a romanticized day in my life. Like, but if you were a truly romantic person, you wouldn't feel the need to say a romanticized day in my life, because it's something that you would unconsciously, inherently just do.
Yeah.
I'm not discounting or discrediting
no, but there's
people that do that, but
there's an aesthetic around romanticizing things, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think it actually is quite damaging and detracts from the act of romanticizing itself. It kind of makes it superficial and cheap and tacky.
That's what I was trying to say about like being a writer in that sense. Trying to balance that, rawness and that superficiality is so difficult as a writer, but I feel like the modern age really demands that. Yeah. But I think, like, even thinking, and I'm a big person for this, even thinking, like, I can't show someone that because I'll be quite embarrassed about it. There's even a level of, like, superficial, like, value behind that. Like, I'm worried about how that's going to be perceived and the aesthetic of it. I don't know. I think it's all about perception.
When you keep saying superficial, what I don't mean what does superficial mean, but as in what do you mean when you talk about superficiality, like, in relation to romanticism?
How do I say it? Like, going out of your way to achieve a certain effect or a certain perception.
Right.
Rather than, like, it being natural. Like, you know how when someone comes up to you and they're like, oh, I see you as, like, this colour, for example. Like, oh, like, that's... And you're like, oh, that's really nice. And that's not because necessarily that you've tried to achieve that, but because that's something that, like, you're like, oh, that's nice. But, when you go out of your way and then it gets acknowledged, you're like, oh, great.
Yeah.
Like, I have succeeded, but there's something more complimentary in it when you've not succeeded, when you've not done it purposefully.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
I think also, like, book-wise, it depends on purpose and intent.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the big thing, isn't it?
That's why I pulled these off my shelf.
Yes.
A few minutes before we started filming. Just, I thought, initial reactions that I feel like speak to what we're trying to say. So, first example for me, again, aesthetic. I've got them to show you so you can see them.
But even the covers portray what you're about to say about the books, I think, as well.
I also agree. This is something that feeds into it. This is The Starless Sea by Romanticism, which is undoubtedly a book that I absolutely love.
Yeah.
It's really good. I haven't read it. I read it years and years ago, but it's a fabulous book. However, I feel like this book's surface level concern is, I'm not saying it's not necessarily deep and intellectually challenging, because I think it is, and it introduces some really interesting ideas. However, one of its prime initial concerns is floral writing, extravagant writing, and this is a book about words themselves. And so I think Erin Morgenson does a good job in really drawing your attention just to her writing itself, to the words themselves. I think that's an example of something that's more concerned with the aesthetic and romanticising the act of writing.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like even that opening line I was telling you before, there was a pirate in the basement. The pirate is a metaphor, but also still a person. The basement could rightly be considered a dungeon. That's not necessary as an opening line. So I think, The Starless Sea is something that kind of demonstrates that, and that's a book that's incredibly popular and people know and love. And so I think it's a good touchstone for that kind of...
I've got it. It's the difference between doing it for yourself or doing it for the perception of others.
Yeah, it's that whole argument ultimately is that art is for the maker, but as soon as art
becomes consumerist,
becomes something that the artist is making for the consumer deliberately, then it's ultimately going to alter the way that they approach their work.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, like with poetry being raw versus like technical. Is that because you're trying to, well, not necessarily technical, but like...
Yeah, but I think rawness with poetry is a term that
You hate it.
Yeah, it's not a term that I enjoy.
But I can't work out what I'm the term that I'm trying to go for.
I know
what's the difference? What's the opposite of superficiality?
Genuine, being genuine.
Yes.
But I think my issue was, I don't know. I think it's a kind of reductive word.
Yeah. To
say something is raw. I think ultimately, if you write something that is intrinsic or fundamentally coming from you and your own experience, which is something I don't actually do as a writer very often.
Yeah.
Inevitably, your experience comes into things, but that's not my initial intention. But I think if you're going into writing something with the intention of having that conversation with yourself
Yeah.
through your art.
Yeah.
I don't think that's raw. I just think it's just being genuine.
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking of would be the opposite of raw, is like, did that word flow from your pen, or did you look up at the synonym of it on the internet?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I mean, like...
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Like, you know how, like, there's that... I think poetry is a really interesting conversation to have with aesthetic, because there's so much aesthetic surrounding poetry. Like, so much aesthetical value, because it is, people do view it as, like, you know, a very romantic, you're going to use long words and it's going to rhyme and it's going to sound magical and floral and lovely. So, like, people are inclined to then go onto the internet and look up synonyms and get, like, 9-letter words for their fucking countdown, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and whack that in their poem.
Yeah, but I find ultimately the poetry, contemporary poetry that's most exciting and interesting is what does precisely the opposite of that.
There we go. That's my point. Let's go. We got there.
You know, if you look at like C.A. Conrad, for example, the book of Frank, that book is bonkers, and it's the most bizarre poetry I've actually ever encountered. But there's something about it that feels really true.
Yeah.
As bizarre as it is, and as kind of elusive and surreal as it is, something about that feels genuine and true to the poet.
Yeah.
Whether it's about them or not, it can still feel true to them in that it's come from them authentically.
And I'm a classicist, so like I am a sucker for, and like my favourite era is the Romantics. I'm a sucker for that floral, aesthetic, gorgeous writing, and like writers like this, like Donna Tartt is a great example. Like, she's a beautiful writer, and I could sit and talk about lines from her book all day because she's purposefully quotable, right? So it took me a while to warm up to the idea of things like contemporary poetry and even just contemporary writing, because I think the thing with contemporary poetry and writing, I think it's really clear when someone is doing it for the consumerist value of it,
for sure.
or for the inherent need to write that, they want to, you know, do that.
Yeah.
And I think a big thing with contemporary writing that I think is a really good pushback against romanticism and aesthetic, like obsession with the aesthetic, is that poetry is not afraid to be simplistic anymore. And
but sometimes it can be complex in its simplicity.
exactly, and I think that we now value that so much more than we had done 10, 15 years ago. We are not afraid to say something as simple as, like, you know, just a flat out statement is beautiful anymore.
Yeah.
We can say that now. Even still, like, that's become a lot more accepted, but I still think we are clinging to that aesthetic.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Too much.
Yeah.
And I think that the most valuable work can be those simple ones, but they're not the ones being pushed forward. The poetry collections that... I mean, the Fitzgeraldo is a great example. I would have thought that they would have flopped otherwise.
Yeah, I've got one on my desk somewhere here.
You have, somewhere.
Here
Like,
we go.
this is such a good pushback.
It is, but
I
actually...
think in its own way it's aesthetic.
It is, but yeah, actually, that's what I was going to say. There's something strange going on with Fitzgeraldo, because I feel like perhaps the intention there was exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
However, there's a whole new obsession with minimalistic cover
Yes.
design. A lot of small publishers are doing it. Prototype are doing it. Fitzgeraldo are doing it.
Yeah.
Gallilega Press are doing it.
Yeah.
Even Faber do it with their typographic poetry covers, which are kind of iconic now. I don't know where that started from. I don't know the publisher's intention.
Yeah.
But one thing that I do see coming back, and I actually really like, is people's kind of obsession with, you know, simplistic cover design. But again, it's a vicious cycle, because that also leads into the consumerism of it.
Yeah,
because people will just think, you know, it's a Fitzgerald edition. You know, I get it. They all look nice on my shelf, kind of thing.
Well, maybe this is it.
Yeah.
Maybe what we're really realising here is that aesthetic can never be removed from us.
No.
We are inherently visual creatures, I suppose.
Yeah.
Things that were once revolutionary within a year or so become the new norm, because people think, oh, aesthetic, I'm cool because I like that thing. And the aesthetic becomes attached to it. And like a certain... It's like a good example, just off the top of my head, would be like rock and roll. When it first started out, that's revolutionary. The whole aesthetic was growing with it. It wasn't entirely established yet. And then the minute it hit mainstream, it had an established aesthetic. It had like an established form. that you could try and achieve through different creative outlets.
Yeah.
And it just became an aesthetic. Maybe nothing is original. Things stop being original too fast.
Yeah.
Because we just choose to market it like that.
Yeah. I agree.
Ali Smith is an interesting example.
Yeah, I mean, there's two more here that I...
Yeah, so we've got a more classical writing style, I suppose.
Yeah, the writing feels very deliberate. And I think, any good writer, their style is obviously deliberate. Ali Smith is, I think, if you've been here before, know how I feel about Ali Smith. She's my favourite.
But she's Marmite.
But she is Marmite.
Interesting to this conversation.
It is. I know a lot of people who adore Ali Smith. I know a lot of people personally and through reading reviews that hate Ali Smith. And I think the reason for that is her writing style. It's incredibly casual, it's conversational, it's blunt, it goes off on tangents, it's very loose with form and very colloquial in its presentation and expression. I'd never know how to quite talk about Ali Smith because she's so kind of elusive to me. As a writer, but I think what she manages to do incredibly well in all of her books, but particularly House We Both, which is my personal favourite of hers, she takes this very stripped back style and yet still manages to so accurately and precisely articulate a character, human condition, relationships between characters. It's all so clear, and yet her style is so paradoxically casual, ambiguous, elusive, and I think there's something so clever about that. But I think that is exactly why she's so Marmite. But there's something about her style that I think, bats against what we were talking about. Neither is it highly aestheticised, if that's a word, floral, exquisite to the extent that Erin Morgenstern's is, nor is it as stripped back and blunt as Sally Rooney is, for example. She manages to do something just incredibly unique, and she has her almost own aesthetic, I think. When I think of Ali Smith, I have a very specific style, image, mood, feeling, and that's, I think, quite rare to get from writers nowadays, and it's something that that's why I will always just keep returning to her. And if you haven't read How to Be Both, what are you doing?
Well,
it's so good.
We'll take a quick break because that's a great tune into this. What have you been reading lately? I know there's a book you want to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Should we go with the aesthetic and I'll get it off my shelf?
Yeah.
Most recent book that I've finished that was not for university, Percival Everett's James, which is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, which I have not read. So if you're thinking I need to have read Huckleberry Finn before I read this, no, you don't. Don't need to. No excuses. Buy it and read it. This actually, weirdly, is the one on the Booker long list. Did it get shortlisted? Yeah, shortlisted. Booker shortlist then, that I was actually least inclined to read, the most sceptical about. However, this is going to be Book of the Month for Waterstones in maybe when you see this, I don't know when it's going up, but it's going to be in March. And so the copies arrived and I was like, I'm just going to give it a go. Guys, what I love so much about this is how it just has a bit of everything. It's a very disturbing, essential and kind of gut-wrenching slavery narrative, but similarly it is an adventure narrative, and similarly it is also very funny at times. And I think, what I appreciate so much about this is that very clever combination that I think Percival Everett, I think it's typical of his style from what I've learned speaking to a couple of people I know that have read a few of his other books, in that he can take a very serious and quite disturbing situation, make you feel those feelings and, give you that message and give you that gut punch, and then he takes the edge off with a bit of wit or a bit of humour, and it just really propels the story. I don't necessarily think that, it's an effective method for every narrative. I think there are a lot of stories that need to be told with, perhaps complete sincerity and complete seriousness. Perhaps sincerity isn't the right word because this book is completely sincere. But so the style for me was a big thing.
Yeah.
Also, the discussion of language I found so fascinating, more than anything, actually. I'll keep this as brief as possible, but this happens at the start of the book, so no spoilers here, don't worry. Huck runs away from home because his father's coming back and his father is abusive. And James/Jim runs away from the house because there is talk of him being sold, so he will be sold away from his family. So his logic is basically, if I'm not there, then I can't be sold away. Mm-hmm. Essentially, they end up on the run together, and you've got black slave and the white child of the slave owner. So it's a very interesting dynamic. What I think is particularly striking about it is the use of language, because what we learn is that James is, and a lot of his family and a lot of the other slaves are very clever in the way that they address and speak to white people. We find out that they actually dumb down their language to speak in this kind of Creole pidgin English, that at some points the way it's written phonetically is actually quite difficult to comprehend. You have to really read the line a few times to kind of grasp what the character's actually saying. But you actually realise that, you know, James can speak perfectly fine, very good English, and yet, you know, he won't do that in front of a white person for fear of them being intimidated. So that's a really interesting dynamic, because Huck also doesn't know that he can speak eloquent English. So basically they're in a cave and James talks in his sleep, and Huck is like, what the fuck, you're talking in perfect English, this is not how you speak. The way that unfolds, and the way they're both keeping secrets from each other about different things, and that very strange dynamic, but fruitful dynamic, I think, ultimately, between Huck as a young white child who is technically, you know, he is part of the overarching problem, and yet he doesn't quite understand that, and he doesn't understand slavery. He doesn't understand why, you know, James doesn't have the same privileges that he does. Despite that, he's still at times very racist towards him. Such an interesting dynamic. But to summarise, if anything, and this is not to reduce the book just to this, because there's so much more to it than that, but as a selling point, just to implore you to go and pick it up, it is such a good adventure story. And I don't read, and not enough of those are brought to my attention in, you know, publishing the past few years. It is just such a good adventure story. Action scene after action scene. It's cinematic, adventurous, exciting. It's so good. And now out in paperback, so you can get your hands on it nice and cheap.
Well, it sold it to me.
Yeah, and when I finished it, I sent Erica a really long voice message because I had to just talk to somebody about it. And where it ended, I could have read, you know, another 300 pages worth.
Yeah.
I was there. What have you been reading recently?
I've been reading nothing that's not academic lately, because I've been preparing for my dissertation, because I'm conscious of the fact that I'm going to have to do a lot of reading to try and narrow down the topic that I want to do it on.
Right.
But one thing I suppose that I could talk about is I started to read Ivanhoe.
Right.
Which is a bit fun for me, because I really like that era of history. But ultimately, one thing that I'm finding really interesting to read about and explore as a literary sort of thing, the presentation of history and historical figures through literature and the preservation of history. Because we get very little insight into history, if not for literature, I would think, in terms of humans and feelings and connection to our past. I don't think it would happen if not for literature. But I think it's really interesting looking back at things like Nordic literature and stuff. We find it pretty much impossible to find out actually what was going on at that time. Norse literature is really interesting because it's very integral to the creation of what we know literature as now. And family sagas were really interesting. They had basically a Doomsday Book back when they and you know what the Doomsday Book is?
No.
So basically the Doomsday Book was like it was William the Conqueror, I think, that brought the Doomsday Book. The Doomsday Book was like a big book that was like, these are all the people, these are what they own, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, right, okay.
A catalogue.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the name because it's an Icelandic name and I don't remember that very well. But when they first settled in Iceland, that was a thing as well. And so we have like accounts of, okay, this is like, these are the people that existed and these are the things they had. But then it would be like, and it'd be really matter of fact. And then it'd be like, yes, but this person was cursed and killed by a witch.
Oh.
So then you're like, okay,
right.
So how much of this is like true then? because obviously we're all in denial about the supernatural. I don't know how I feel about it. That's a whole different topic, right? But a lot of family sagas are written like that. They're all really matter of fact. One thing that I thought was really interesting, that was a discussion I sort of read about, was family sagas are not written from like a point of view of a character, but rather from an omniscient narrator. But that narrator never tries to assume what the character is thinking or feeling. So it is entirely matter of fact.
Right.
So like it's like, okay, like reading a court case basically. Not this is why it happened, not this was what was feeling at the time. It's just like, oh yes, Canute killed Ragnar, rip, you know, and this was the person's reaction to it, and then that was, and like people will dip in and out of the narrative because as they would in real life.
Yeah.
And yet because of those supernatural elements, we'll be like, that saga didn't happen though, it's not real, but that person did exist, we know that person existed.
Yeah.
But was this real? And like I think that's really interesting to read literature from that point of view when it's about the writing of real figures in history. Wolf Hall is an interesting example, for example, or even Hamnet. I've not really read Hamnet.
Hamnet is fabulous.
I need to read it, but
so good.
you get a perception of these real life people through it. It's not necessarily true though.
Well, no, we knew very, very, very little about Shakespeare's wife.
And it's very difficult to discern that and like, you know, come away from that book objectively if, you know, like you were to like then go into studying something historically.
Also, she is a witch in that book, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And yet you've got all this historical material in the back that's like, this was the house.
Yep.
And this is the floor plan, and this is the medical records.
Yeah.
And so it's it's an interesting conflict.
This is it. This is the conflict that I'm finding really interesting about literature, is like trying to discern reality from fiction and how blended those things can be in writing, and it makes history so difficult to study because we'll never know. We will never know how much of these family sagas were real. We'll never know. Like Arthurian legend, to this day we still argue, was he real?
Yeah.
And we'll never know. Even modern books doing it, you start feeling sympathy for these people that were real and probably did really horrific things. And I think that's really interesting, and that's what I've basically been trying to study and read about lately. That's where my readings are
going. I'm excited to read your stuff.
Thank you.
It's going to be cool.
I'll try and work something out with that. Yeah. But I don't know if I told that very well, but...
No, you did.
Okay. Bit of a rant there.
Only the things I've been at the moment are... I've started another Ali Smith book.
Another?
Because I tried to stop myself for a while, because when I read one of hers, I tend to just want to read loads. So I was like, I'm just going to give myself a while in this new year, not touch Ali Smith. Lo and behold, here we are. This was only her second book, I think. Book of short stories, all about, or a lot of them are rooted in public libraries, which is really interesting. Absolutely loving this so far. Then I'm dipping in and out of it at the minute, but I'm going to read it in full in due course. Emblem by Lucy Mercer, which is a beautiful ekphrastic collection. Very, very good. Published by Prototype, hence just incredibly interesting anyway. And for uni right now, I am reading Face of War, Writings from the Front Line, 1937 to 85 by Martha Gellhorn.
What module is this for, Oliver?
This is for a module about...
conflicting words, right?
War literature.
And how have you been finding the overreading on this module, Oliver?
Well, here's the thing, right, is that I found the first war poetry, I didn't enjoy it as such, but I found it interesting.
Yeah.
Because poetry at that time was so much more everyday and colloquial than it is now. Although I think we are drifting back towards that, which I'm very happy about. Then we read Company K by William March, which I found incredible. It really deeply moved me, actually. Really, really has changed my perspective on First and Second World War literature, which is something I actively avoid usually. This was a big challenge for me, and that's that book's got me interested in reading more, actually, which is interesting. But then I read Regeneration by Pat Barker. That was the most boring 2 days of my life.
I've never seen Oliver struggle to read a book before.
I love books where nothing happens. Slice of life. We know this. Love it. However, Pat Barker, if you listen to this, which you won't be, but if you are, listen in. Sort yourself out. Because, like...
I don't think you can say that to a published author.
The fact that this is a trilogy... There are 3 of these. 3! I had to read the first one. That's 300 pages. This edition is Nearly 900 pages.
I love that you bought it thinking, I'm going to really like this.
I genuinely bought the trilogy binder because I was like, if I enjoy the first book, I can just carry on reading them. Because I've heard good things about Pat Barker, Silence of the Girls. I was like, Regeneration, this is a series from the 90s. Regeneration is like an absolute modern classic.
Yeah.
Holy shit. So that was a shame. End of conversation. It's quite unfortunate. I think it will still make for a good discussion.
Yeah.
Because it's a book about, if you didn't know, it's essentially about a hospital where soldiers would go from the front line. They'd go have therapy and recover, in theory, because you can get over PTSD that quickly and easily. And you follow a couple of characters that were actually real people. You follow a couple of poets, assume, Wilfred Owen.
Theoretically sounds great.
Which sounds great, but unfortunately it was just so boring. So boring. But these things happen, and I give it a good go.
Well, I will say, not to get you excited or anything, but my plan was this week to read that Seamus Heaney collection that I bought the other month on your recommendation.
Oh, you bought Death of the Naturalist?
Yeah, I bought it with you. You literally, you were working, and I went up to you and was like, Oliver.
Yeah.
So, for the next episode, I will be here to talk about that. We might scrap. So, come back for that. Because I might upset Oliver. I don't think I will.
He's just, that collection is...
I don't think I will upset you, but...
Oh, God.
It'd be really funny if I just walk in and I'm like, Oliver, I won't. Even if I don't like it, I won't be that mean, but I would think that'd be really funny.
I can take people's opinions. I might, think they're categorically, fundamentally 100% wrong, but I can hear them.
Can you?
Yeah.
You can block them out and pretend that you're...
Yeah, I'll just zone out. That's my favourite collection of poetry ever.
Yeah.
So
I'm excited. And my mission of the year is to read Anna Karenina. I've not started that yet.
My mission of the year is to read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Yes. Let me know if that's good, because I really want to read that.
I never got round to.
So I want to do that. I've also got, top of my reading list at the minute, on Anna Karenina, The Stoner.
Oh, John Williams Stoner. Yeah.
I need to read that book.
I love that book so much.
Because you're pushing that on me.
Again, so boring. Nothing happens. Absolutely love it.
Lanny, I need to read, but I'm waiting for you to read Dorian Gray, because that's for a video.
I'm quite nervous to read Dorian Gray, actually.
I'm nervous for you to read Dorian Gray. I know I'm going to like Lanny because I've already started reading it and I like it.
There is so much weight on this book for me, not just from you, but from the world.
Dun dun dun! From the whole podcast.
The world, society, everything. Everybody's obsessed with Dorian Gray.
Not everybody, but if you like Dorian Gray, you like Dorian Gray, I think.
Yeah.
We did go and watch A Real Pain.
It was a real pain in our hearts.
Guys, that was really sad.
Just wasn't the one. It was just a bit shit, to be honest.
I wouldn't say it was a bit shit. It just felt a bit flat for me. There was just, yeah.
I think you enjoyed it still more than I did.
Oh, yeah. I appreciate a cyclical narrative, but I did not want that from that. Give me a little bit of something, you know?
The ending was...
Give me a little bit of something. But the acting was good. Really appreciate Kieran Culkin. And you really liked Jesse Eisenberg, which is good, because that means I can convince you to watch some more Jesse Eisenberg movies. Yeah,
just not watching The Social Network.
Why?
Because if there's a film in this world that doesn't appeal to me, it's that.
Valid. For Halloween, you're going to watch Zombieland.
Okay.
But it's not really a horror movie. It's just a really funny, well-made, actually funny. We know I don't laugh at things.
Yeah, because The Real Pain wasn't that funny.
No,
either.
but Zombieland is funny.
Okay.
And it's Emma Stone, Woody Harrelson.
Okay.
Do you know what Woody Harrelson is? No. But he's great. He's a great actor. You'll like him. Actually funny two movies, so I'm going to get you to watch that. It's Jesse Eisenberg playing himself again.
What else does he do?
Nothing.
Even when he did his speech when he won the award.
Jesse Eisenberg. But, well, it wasn't... Kieran Culkin won it, didn't he? And then he accepted it on his behalf.
No, I think...
I know Kieran Culkin won an acting award for it, and
Jesse won an award.
I think he probably won a directorial award.
Yeah, because he was thanking his wife and stuff. So
yeah, you weren't a big fan of Kieran Culkin's acting with it, were you?
I just think it was just fine. There's nothing great about it, but there's nothing bad about it. It just didn't particularly
appeal,
impress me. But I did like just I also saw myself massively in
Jesse Eisenberg's
Jesse
character.
Eisenberg.
Yeah.
Like, it was quite uncomfortable sometimes because I was like, wow.
Well, I've always said to you,
This is like...
Jesse Eisenberg is you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That really hit when I saw it, to be fair.
Yeah. So you're welcome. I know you well. Yeah, so that's what we've been reading. That's what we've been watching.
Mm-hmm.
Back to aesthetic, or do we have anything else to say?
I'm not sure. I don't think there's anything else I particularly thought about. But my message to the world is, if you want to actually romanticize your life, get off your fucking phone. Like,
Don't do it for other people, do it for yourself.
if you're
That's my
filming
message.
TikTok that's like, spend a romanticized day in my life, well, you're not really romanticising, are you? If you're just putting everything into a CapCut?
Yeah.
CapCut timeline and hashtagging it, like, it's just not.
Oliver's beefing with TikTok again.
Day in the lives, great, do what you want. And actually, a well-edited day in the life is very satisfying to watch, even albeit if they are most of the time incredibly unrealistic. But if you're doing a romanticised day in your life...
Oliver, can you clarify me something, just for the viewers? Do you have TikTok downloaded on your phone?
No.
This man has a genuine, visceral hate for that app.
Yeah, I do.
I respect it.
I have a hate for all of them, but I have Instagram because I have to, like, promote what I do to an extent, but...
Ooh! That reminds me,
Wow.
because a part of my mission of the year,
Yeah.
you've handled the conversation of aesthetic in your own writing, haven't you? Haven't you, Oliver?
I mean, yeah, I suppose, to an extent.
Can you actually talk about this? Because I want to understand how lampoonery interacts with this idea. Because I have not heard you talk about your own work, really, because you refuse to. Oliver refuses to be proud of himself. And it's quite infuriating, because I'm so incredibly proud of him, even though I have no right to be, because, like, what honour do I have to bestow such pride? But I do, because he's amazing, and I idolise him. But I would actually love to hear you talk about this in response to your writing, because you said this to me, and I want to understand what in particular you were going for in your writing.
Okay.
Not even for the sake of promotion, I'm just intrigued.
Okay, so Lampoonery of the Shallow was the title of originally a collection and then became a show.
That Oliver wrote.
A spoken word show, which has now evolved into reading B-sides for the start of this year for a few nights, which is a more kind of elusive, surreal, experimental version of what Lampoonery was, essentially. But yeah, Lampoonery of the Shallow, title within itself is essentially mocking the narrow and shallow-minded people that we are constantly surrounded by. And by shallow and narrow-minded, I don't necessarily mean, I'm not saying people are stupid or intellectually inept, because that's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm talking about, people that have such a limited worldview and are so kind of opposed to listening to people and opening their minds to, other possibilities of just the everyday. It's what I noticed, it wasn't deliberate, but the recurring theme that brought the poems together in the end was, this kind of underlying distaste that permeated all of the poems, or a lot of the poems that I was writing, for people who refuse to kind of engage with worldviews and ideas outside of their own narrow perception. Yeah. But yeah, I suppose it interacts with aesthetic as well. Discussion of superficiality, sometimes explicit, sometimes a bit less so. The older poems typically are more explicit and the later ones are not. But yeah, I think just what permeates it is that distaste towards shallowness, full stop.
So do you think that the obsession with aesthetic is rather shallow, or rather the overconsumption of the pursuit?
Yeah, I think it's fleeting.
Yeah, aesthetic is incredibly fleeting, yeah.
But I think so much, and again, what it engages with, not just aesthetic, but kind of our modern world now, to speak generally and broadly, is everything
is a trend.
Everything is a trend, everything is a product, everything is fleeting, everything is shallow. People don't listen to other people, they're not willing to talk, they're not willing to debate. And I think, just speaking, may I add, very generally, there's just a gradual and kind of crescendoing shift away from people having, deeper values and understandings of things.
We are too bothered with the aesthetic, the external.
Yeah, or the surface level of
Yeah.
things. Yeah, there's this kind of, I think Nick Cave phrases it as like a belligerent dogmatism towards things, and a bit of humanity wouldn't go astray, which I think kind of sums it up.
Yeah, it's like the difference between buying a load of books to put them on a shelf and buying a load of books to actually consume what's inside of them.
Yeah, I think so. To an extent, yeah.
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 Mm.
So that's how...
Like the
how
external
can you engage with that.
intellectualism that you could argue you have because you own a load of books, even if you've not read them. Like, you can present yourself as an intellectual.
Yeah, it's that kind of presentation of the self, which ultimately is false.
Yes.
Yeah. So
That's the conclusion, really.
that's in a nutshell how that engages with it, I suppose, if that answers your question.
It does. It's incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
It's gonna help when I reread those poems.
Yeah.
I just love that title as well. What a bang title.
Yeah, it's a shame I don't have the... If it was 2 days later, I'd have the new copies to show you all. I can't.
Check out Oliver's Instagram.
Yeah, well, nothing much really goes on there, but I do try and post things that are happening.
Yeah.
If I remember.
Yeah.
Which I usually don't, so...
Yeah. Quick crossover for the sake of trying to make you more proud and loud about how accomplished you are at such a young age.
Anyway, is that the end of the episode?
Do you want to do anything? Are you embarrassed now, Oliver?
I feel like we've touched on pretty much everything we
I think we
wanted to.
have. Yeah, I think ultimately, conclusion, don't be afraid to just do things for yourself and not the perception of it.
You don't always have to share with the online world what you have done in a day, for example, in order to have some kind of self-gratification. If what you're doing means enough to you, then it should be gratifying enough on a personal, internal level. You don't need to have that validation from people that aren't even real, basically.
There's a beauty in dancing for yourself.
Yeah.
Dancing.
Thank you for listening as always, and we'll see you very soon.
Yes, see you soon. Hopefully we'll be back to regular episodes.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.